digitaljamsessions.com.
Hello and welcome to this Digital Jam session. Today we're joined by Jeremy Dalton of PwC, and we have back with us again Kathleen Wallace, one of our original alumni members of the VR Writers Room. Hello guys and welcome back.
Hello. Thank you, Tanya.
So for the benefit of our listeners who may not have caught previous episodes where you have both been with us on the show, would you care to explain a little bit more about what you do and tell us a little bit more about your involvement in the context of VR and immersive technologies? I'm going to start with you, Jeremy, because I think that does take some explaining for you.
Sure, no problem. Hopefully it doesn't take too much explaining. I'll do it in a nutshell.
Well, it's just that when you say PwC, people don't immediately think VR.
I know. The first thoughts are accountancy, taxation. Hopefully I can change that in the next few lines. So I work in PwC's Emerging and Digital Technologies team, which sits in our consulting practice. And my specialism is in virtual reality and augmented reality technologies. So I would talk to companies and help them understand the benefits of these technologies in particular, what it means for them now and in the future, how it's going to affect their business, and how they can take advantage of the opportunities that virtual reality and augmented reality offer to them right now. That, in a nutshell, is what I'm all about. And as Tanya mentioned previously, I am a VR evangelist. I do personally believe in it, and I have a number of stories to show how far I'm willing to go with implementing virtual reality solutions in my house.
Let's not give your wife any more pain about rehashing the story of the rather large hole in your living room.
Oh, I want to hear that sometime.
Kathleen, why don't you tell us a little bit more about exactly what you're up to at the moment? Because you do such a broad array of different things. But why don't you tell us a little bit more about what you're up to at the moment?
Sure. So I'm a filmmaker among many other things that I do. And the filmmaking that I'm working on right now is short form videos meant to be viewed on mobile phones. So I'm really working in the mobile space, trying to get into the mobile space. And everything that I do is around affecting change through storytelling. So how do we use comedy to address taboo topics, for example? Or how do you use a narrative to introduce topics that are difficult for people to talk about? And my interest in VR and my involvement in VR came largely through Tanya, who basically said, you have to do this. And I'm so grateful to her for that because it's fascinating. And my interest in VR and what I'm working on in terms of VR is I'm very interested in it because I do think it can be a powerful tool to affect change and have conversations that are difficult. And two, the question then for me is, how do we tell a narrative story in virtual reality? And that's actually, if you go back to just to plug one more time, the VR Writers Room, a lot of what we talked about and a lot of what is very interesting to me in VR.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for joining us again, guys. So I wanted to talk about a conversation that we had a little bit earlier on where we were talking about people who evangelize, because that's kind of the phrase that we're using to describe you, Jeremy. But people who are, educating others about VR and the immersive entertainment industry as such, do tend to make a rather lot of broad sweeping assumptions about the degree of knowledge that people have or the degree of understanding that people have, not just about the hardware technology end of this, but really about the business impact or the business implication of this. And I say this on the basis of, as a for example, recently when talking to people about the use or application of VR and AR for the military or for the defense industries, I got a lot of people who were kind of, quite unsure as to why we would be talking to those types of industries about VR and AR, because for their perspective, VR and AR is about entertainment, it's about gaming, or it's about film, and it's not about necessarily the military industries. And that's everything from logistics through to, PTSD, all the way through to, just generally the visualization and training techniques. So there's a whole broad range of different possibilities here, but they're not necessarily something that your average, VR industry veteran is necessarily going to be thinking about, because they are perhaps more skewed towards entertainment. And I found this quite interesting that there does seem to be rather a lot of assumptions that fly around about what the potential is for this industry and where it really sits and what the potential monetization is. And Jeremy, I know that you've run into these types of conversations in the past as well. And I'm curious to hear from you, your perspective in terms of where do we think we're going wrong with the articulation of the potential for VR and its current application?
I think perhaps we're not going totally wrong in that sense. I'd say what we're doing is trying to pick the low-hanging fruit initially. And I'm not saying it's at all easy to implement a VR project in the entertainment or the video gaming world. But of course, that is the first thing that comes to consumers' minds. And a lot of the perceptions in the public right now are that virtual reality has very strong implications for the entertainment world. And it does. But that's not to say, as you've rightly identified, that it doesn't have any opportunities elsewhere. I mean, there are so many industries that virtual reality and augmented reality can help, from the sports world to the healthcare world to the tourism industries, and a whole host of others that we haven't yet dug deep into. And I think as those industries mature and they start to see perhaps virtual reality and augmented reality solutions being used successfully in the entertainment world and therefore being more accepted widely in the mainstream and the public world, they will become more accepting and more open to seeing what virtual reality and augmented reality can do for them. And at that point, it will become an easier conversation. And that's my view. So I think it's a matter of time, but I don't necessarily think we're doing something wrong at the moment. I don't see anything particularly wrong with pushing entertainment and virtual reality and augmented reality and entertainment as far as it can go.
Okay, so I suppose here's the main question from my perspective then, which is that when we talk about VR and we talk about monetization of VR, I think the major kind of issue so far, and I don't mean to sound very negative when I say that, but the main challenge that we've had so far is that there isn't a huge amount of monetization occurring. So when we say that we're going to do a game or we're going to do a film or we're doing entertainment VR, there isn't necessarily a huge amount of money in that. And there's many different reasons for that. Everything from the limited number of HMDs in the market and the limited amount of content available in the market and various other types of issues as to why we're not, seeing people making, huge amounts of money from VR content in the entertainment space. But then when we look at other sectors, such as out of home and in theme parks, for example, this is an industry that's been proactively utilizing VR and aspects of immersive entertainment for decades and is making money, proactively making money at the moment. But when you talk to somebody who is reasonably recent into this industry, their perception is that all the money to be made is in film and game rather than in these other areas. And I'm curious from your perspective, Kathleen, because you were somebody that kind of came into this quite recently on the basis of, I drew you in on the basis of this is a relevant area of interest for you. It's adjacent to the areas that you would normally be working within. And so you've gone through that educational process. And I'd be interested to hear your perspective as to that perception of who's really making the money and where the real opportunities lie at the moment in VR.
Yeah, I think one of the first things that comes to mind when I think about that is educating the broader public about exactly what VR is. I remember very clearly telling you about a 360 video that I did, and I was so excited that I'd done this virtual reality thing. And you saying to me, Kathleen, that's not VR. It's 360. And that really, for me, I had to shift my paradigm. I had to shift the way that I considered this, because for me, just being able to be in a space and turn around, wear the headset and turn around and actually see a photograph from 360 degrees, that to me was a virtual experience. So I had to shift my own personal understanding of what virtual reality is. And I think that's probably, Jeremy, something you come up against a lot when you're trying to talk to different companies as well, is that we just don't, it's moving so quickly and it's developing so quickly in so many different ways. How do we get people to understand exactly what it is so that you can talk to them about the different possibilities when their understanding of what it is and what it can be is so narrow?
You're absolutely right. And can I just add there quickly, Tanya, that when you talk about, Kathleen, when you're talking about educating others on, the real uses of VR and trying to get them a real understanding of what this technology can do, the key element that I've found, and it may sound obvious to people, but I've just seen it time and time again so clearly presented to me that it's become a general rule now. It's sort of like Morpheus in the Matrix, where he describes that the Matrix is not something that you can be told about. It's something you have to experience for yourself. The analogy holds completely true for virtual reality and augmented reality technologies. So many times have I gone to both members inside PwC and outside PwC to spread the good word and tell them about virtual reality and its potential, only to be met with a sort of a tone that they're humoring me and that they understand the words that I'm saying, but they're not quite believing in it. So what I do is I say to them, okay, why don't you come along, to our office, have a play around with our virtual reality gear and actually, just try it out. I'm not here to sell HMDs or anything, but just try it for yourself and get an idea. We set up a meeting, they come in, they try it out. I don't have to say anything after that. The moment they take off the headset, they are then selling virtual reality to me in a way, because they've had such an incredible experience. And obviously there's an element of how do you of educating the educators in terms of how do you facilitate an experience for people, but subject for another time. But after that, they are really bought into it and they finally see and they believe in it. So really it all comes down to having to get people to try it out for themselves and actually experience it for them to truly understand where its potential lies.
It's interesting that you say this, because this brings me to another kind of two questions. So first of all, do we feel that perhaps for us who are in our bubble of this VR industry, that perhaps we are we have too many expectations as to what people understand to be VR? So in exactly the example with Kathleen, we talk about the difference between what some might call true VR and 360 film, which we define as different things. Whereas general mainstream consumers who don't have any experience in VR, they just see it all as VR because for them, there is no differentiation. In the same way, the other question I have is that we're talking about the VR face moment when somebody first tries VR, and that's what I call it, is a VR face. They come out and they're just, their eyes are a little bit wider and they've got that kind of, boggled look on them. But when somebody does have that VR face moment, how important do we genuinely feel it is for them to have a high quality experience versus a low end experience? And I say this on the basis of, we know pragmatically there will be more cardboard headsets and more Google Cardboards because they are financially cheaper. They're easier to distribute. We're going to be able to get more of these into consumers' hands than necessarily the high end tethered headsets, whether that's an Oculus or a HTC Vive, because realistically, you're talking about thousands of dollars to be able to get not just the HMD, but the supercomputers and all of the peripherals that you need in order to make that into a high quality, good experience. And so just by natural selection, there's going to be less people who are necessarily going to get their hands on that stuff than they are the lower end of that spectrum. And so I wonder if there is perhaps a certain degree of caution and curation that needs to happen on that low end of the market, where we know that's where the first point of contact will happen. Or as some folks have liked to describe it, this will be the gateway drug into, more heavy duty VR. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this one, Jeremy.
I think you have a point there, Tanya. You're right in that a lot of people's initial experiences will be with the budget end of the virtual reality headset, stuff like Google Cardboard, where the price is cheap, it's been given out for free. In many, many places, there are already millions of Google Cardboard-style headsets going around the world. The only issue with that, of course, is that the quality is far lower. Therefore, the danger is that when someone tries on a Google Cardboard headset and makes an assumption that this is the limit of virtual reality technology, that is an incorrect and dangerous assumption for the industry, because they come away thinking that's all there is to it. And I've seen people very impressed by Google Cardboard headsets, but ultimately, if they're going to be impressed by that, they're going to have a much stronger reaction to the more mid-range or premium headsets. And that's really the story we want to tell them. So I think it's a matter of education that this is a taster, but this is not the end of the virtual reality story.
And I think if I can just jump in, I think one of the considerations is when we're talking about quality, we have to be very mindful of the physical effect of being in a virtual world that is not well constructed. I think we have all had experiences where we have taken off a headset and really just needed to sit down and let the room stop spinning for a little while. And go ahead, Tanya.
No, you're just giving me not so fond memories of a return trip from Manchester.
You're very welcome. So if that is someone's first experience, you're much less likely to have someone come back because of, for example, all I have to say to you is an experience where you don't feel well afterward and your brain automatically goes back there. And this is a real concern if we consider, Tanya, what you started talking about before, which I would call the digital divide, which is that dividing line where affluence is able to experience higher quality and have access to more technology, better equipment, so on and so forth, and use this technology for their advantage, as opposed to people who are not going to have the resources to be able to get the better end technology. And what happens with them if they have a terrible experience, are sick after their first VR experience, and then end up not accessing something that can be, that looks like where entertainment and a lot of different information is going to be distributed.
And I think this is interesting as well, because there are other kind of broad sweeping assumptions. I feel like I'm just trying to systematically burst everybody's bubble as we go through this conversation. But, one of the other things is that there are a lot of people who, they talk about VR in a particular way that makes it feel like this is going to be the next big thing. How many times have we heard that? This is the year of VR, and that it's going to be.
Oh, I get tired of that expression.
But we get this impression from certain types of people that, VR is going to be this thing. It's going to be prevalent in everybody's lives and everybody's going to be using it, and all the mobile phones in the world, we're capable of VR, so therefore we will use VR. And it's kind of like this really broad sweeping assumption that is actually quite difficult to overcome sometimes when you try to remind people that actually VR will be used at relevant times in people's lives at the right moment, and in combination with other technology. It's not going to be that thing that they're going to sit there for 12 hours in the weekend and just play VR. It's going to be that thing that they'll do, and it'll be maybe half an hour in an evening, maybe twice a week, rather than this thing they're going to do every single night for hours and hours. And it's not necessarily just going to be that they'll only ever do mobile VR, with a cardboard device or a high-end, mobile headset, but that they might, do some portable VR when they're away from home. But when they get home, they've got their PlayStation VR, and they've got their Oculus or their HTC Vive, and they're going to try for that deeper experience when they have more time to put towards it, in the same way that, we'll watch a mobile video on our mobile phone when we're commuting, but when we get home, we want to watch it on the TV. And I think that there are too many people who just seem to think that VR is on its own the be all and the end all, and they kind of forget that actually it isn't going to take over everything. It's going to be something that's gradual, and it will take time for that to become something that's very mainstream, and time for it to become a normal everyday part of our lives, in the same way that, when that brick that we all put in our pocket, that we, when the mobile phone first occurred, it wasn't this thing that everybody thought, yes, this is going to completely reinvent the way that we, communicate with one another. That I'm certain that was not the way that people were thinking at the time. It was kind of a cool gadget to have, but nobody ever really envisioned the full scope of the capabilities of what a mobile phone was going to be able to do a decade later. So I'm curious, Jeremy, from your perspective, whether or not you think that there is anything that we can do to kind of mitigate some of those assumptions and expectations, and some of, the really broad sweeping statements that have been made that can sometimes be damaging to the mainstream perception.
Well, the sad thing is that the sweeping statements are being made by the virtual reality circle, so to speak, the people who are inside it, trying to evangelize it. And I'd like to defend myself here by saying I'm not one of those people who make sweeping statements about the greatness of virtual reality. I mean, I am very excited about it and its potential, but saying things like 2015 is going to be the year of VR. No, 2016 is going to be the year of VR. No, 2017 is going to be the year of VR. I guarantee you. And then, of course, if it doesn't come true, then everybody immediately says, well, what happened? All the the press was all going on about this year being the year of VR, and it wasn't the year of VR, and it didn't meet sales. And immediately it just creates a very, very negative atmosphere around the technology, when in fact it can take as long as it wants. It doesn't matter at the end of the day whether consumers bite into it now or next year or the year after. You mentioned when it's right for them to do so, it will appear and it will be there for consumers to avail of the technology as it works for them. So there's no need to artificially predict things like that. And I think it's damaging for us in the VR community to make such statements and put VR and AR technologies up on a pedestal for it to then be knocked down when it doesn't meet that overhyped potential. So everyone stop making those statements, please.
And just to build on that, and something that was said before, is that we're all still exploring this. So we don't all know yet what we can do. We're still figuring that out. And as we figure it out, and as Jeremy goes to the military and says, hey, look, here, try this VR, and then they take it off and they start evangelizing to him, then we're going to have new experiences. Then we're going to start to figure out new ways where we can use this technology. And it's not just one thing. And it will never be just one thing. And because of that, it's like a vine in the ground that is going to grow in all sorts of different directions.
You're absolutely right. Do you know, though, I found it very interesting that when I was having some conversations around military and defense application of VR, one of the complaints that I received from somebody was that the military and defense industries already have their finger in all of the technology pies, and why should we continue to give it to them? And my response was kind of like, well, you do realize that just because you're doing something with defense or military doesn't mean that you're creating a weapon, for starters. But second of all, that actually that investment, that research time that's going into it from that industry, it benefits everybody. It benefits the entire industry, because the findings that we discover and we make in that vertical can easily be applied to every other vertical. And so when anybody makes any progress, whichever vertical they are in, it does benefit the entire community as a whole. And I think that's part of where there does seem to be a bit of a lack of vision sometimes, of really seeing it as an entire community that really does cover every single vertical, rather than it's all about military, or it's all about gaming, or it's all about film. And I think, Jeremy, you and I have been to enough events together where you do see that kind of very isolating attitude of, this is all about games, or this is all about, films, or whatever the thing is. And that's their only real perspective when it comes to the application of VR and the development of content. So
you're right. And I'll just say quickly that it's worthwhile people specializing in certain niches within VR, because as it grows and becomes, a larger beast, there will be, within each application of virtual reality in different industries, there will be very, very niche sort of lessons to learn, to understand experiences of how it's been implemented in that industry. And really, you're likely to get a lot of value out of those who have experiences in those individual subsections. So at the moment, there may be a lot of people in, entertainment and video gaming, but in the future, I'm sure there'll be specialists to do with VR and AR in all these other different industries.
And I think the more conversation that we have, the more cross-industry pollination that's going on, the better the industry will be for everybody. So what I'm going to say, though, is, as always, we like to try and kind of, ask a big scoping question of our lovely guests. And so I'm going to throw this one at you, which is, what do you think is going to be the most important thing that we can do to help, I'm not going to say evangelize, but to educate the masses, shall we say, about what the potential for VR and AR and immersive entertainment or immersive tech really is, and what it means in their lives? What do you think is that thing that's really going to start to shift perceptions and shift the balance of how people perceive these technologies in these industries? And I'm going to start with you, Kathleen.
I knew you were going to come to me first. Well, my perspective is I always go back to storytelling. Storytelling is my big thing. And I think that VR is so nebulous that you can say to someone, define VR to me, and they'll give you one explanation. And you can say to the next person, they'll give you another explanation. So if we can start seeing uses of VR more in media. So, for example, if you're watching your favorite TV show and somebody on that TV show has a VR experience, we have to look for those connectors, those places where most people are going. And how do we meet them in those places where they're going? And how do we incorporate VR and education about VR into those spaces? And we know that storytelling is a very, very effective educator, that if we can get people engaging in a story, it lights up lots of different parts of their brain, as opposed to just giving them direct information and hoping that they remember it. Because when you're watching a story, you're emotionally involved, and that's lighting up different parts of your brain. And so you're getting a more visceral experience, and you're actually learning a great deal from it. So I would love to see VR used in greater, or I should say not VR used in, but examples of VR being used in more popular media as a way of education. But, yeah.
Okay, Jeremy, what about you? What's your thoughts on this?
I think one of the key challenges of the storytelling element that Kathleen talks about is helping users to understand that VR as a term is fluid rather than a single point. Because a lot of people have this idea, as we discussed, virtual reality. If someone has a Google Cardboard experience, that experience is immediately to them all that virtual reality is, when it's not. There are budget experiences, there are mid-range experiences, there are premium experiences, all with their cons and their positives as well. In addition to that, there's also on the content side different levels of quality in terms of the experience. And we talked earlier on about VR versus 360, and that is an ongoing argument within the industry. But at the end of the day, the syntax or the terminology or the semantics doesn't really matter to the end user. If they put on a headset and they have an experience, whether that's delivered through 360 video or through computer-generated imagery via, an engine, that to them will be virtual reality. But at the end of the day, users need to we need to help them open their minds to the fact that VR is a spectrum, and so is augmented reality to that extent, in the sense that you have on one side Pokemon Go, which technically comes under augmented reality, and you also have the technology behind the Microsoft HoloLens, which is also considered augmented reality by a lot of people, although Microsoft will call it mixed reality to try and differentiate it from a marketing perspective. There's a lot of differences to it. So helping others to keep an open mind that VR and AR, they are spectrums, and they should bear that in mind.
Okay. Well, thank you for joining us today. And as always, we like to give our listeners a way to be able to find out a little bit more about you and to follow you. So we ask you to do that by sharing with us your social media handle of choice. Why don't you tell us what that is, Kathleen?
At Kathleen Wallace, KathLeenWallace.
On Twitter?
On Twitter, yes.
Wonderful. And Jeremy, what about yourself?
You can catch me either on LinkedIn, feel free to connect and get my profile via the URL jeremydalton.info. Or if you want, I'm also on Twitter, and my handle is at Jeremy C. Dalton, and that's JeremyCDalton.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for listening. If you enjoy this content, don't forget to subscribe and review, and follow us on Twitter at Digital Jam Ltd.
digitaljamsessions.com